The Great West and the Agricultural Revolution, 1865 to 1896. When the Civil War clashed to a close, the frontier was the next thing that America surged towards. Sprawling in expanse, the Great West was a rough square that measured about 1,000 miles on each side. It embraced mountains, plateaus, deserts, and plains. Its residents were the Indians, the buffalo, and the wild horse. 25 years later, however, that is, 1890, the entire domain had been made into the territories of Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, and Oklahoma. Unfortunately, a great people already lived in this land. In 1860, about 360,000 Native Americans roamed in this area. They were the Comanches, the Apaches, the Maddens and the Chippewa, the Cheyenne and the Sioux. Just before the beginning of the Civil War, white soldiers ventured into their sacred land. They spread cholera, typhoid, and smallpox. The advancing white population had shrunk the population of the buffalo, causing these tribes to have to fight each other for food. In the 1860s, the federal government had tried to resolve this issue. They herded the tribes together to form the Great Sioux Reservation in present-day Dakota and Oklahoma. There were dozens of tribes posted into this area. They were promised to be left alone. They were also promised food, clothing, and other supplies, but these promises were empty and often violated by corrupt federal agents. With the conclusion of the Civil War, once again the United States had a large army at its disposal. It would utilize this army to remove the Indians. Fully 1/5 of all U.S. Army personnel on the frontier were African American. They were dubbed Buffalo Soldiers by the Indians, supposedly because of the resemblance of their hair to the bison's furry coat. Union armies continued to roll across the plains, and Indian wars became increasingly savage. Aggressive whites sometimes shot peaceful Indians on sight. At Sand Creek, Colorado in 1864, Colonel J. M. Chivington's militia massacred in cold blood some 400 Indians. The Indians responded in kind. In 1866, a Sioux war party ambushed Captain William Fetterman's command of 81 soldiers and civilians in Wyoming's Bighorn Mountains, killing every man and mutilating the corpses. This cycle of ferocious warfare intensified, and in 1866, the federal government abandoned its attempt to construct the Bosman Trail through Montana. The sprawling Great Sioux Reservation was guaranteed to the Sioux tribes. However, in 1874, Colonel George Armstrong Custer led a scientific expedition to the Black Hills of South Dakota and announced he had found gold there. Hordes of greedy gold seekers swarmed into the Sioux lands, and the Sioux again took the warpath, inspired by the influential and wily Sitting Bull. Colonel Custer's 7th Cavalry was then set out to suppress the Indian forces and force them back onto the reservation. They attacked what they had thought to be a lesser force, but turned out to be a superior force of some 2,500 well-armed warriors camped along the Little Bighorn River in present-day Montana. Custer and his 264 officers and men were completely wiped out. This became known as Custer's Last Stand. The U.S. Army, however, was not frightened off. They continued to pursue the Indians and eventually hunted down those that had been responsible for the destruction of Custer's troops. Another horrible instance occurred at Wounded Knee. The 7th Cavalry was dispatched to disarm the Lakota Indian, but a deaf man, complaining that he had paid a lot for his rifle, didn't want to give it up. In the ensuing scuffle, a single shot was fired. The U.S. Army quickly reacted, and a small conflict ensued, with what little Lakota had their weapons still, firing at the officers. However, the U.S. controlled the high ground and 3 of the Indian flanks. The routed Indians attempted to flee, but the cavalry pursued them, cutting them down from behind. Some 300 Indians were killed. 25 U.S. troopers were also killed. However, these are mainly believed to have been the result of friendly fire due to the close-quarter combat that ensued in the village. One of the hardest tribes to subdue were the Apache of Arizona and New Mexico. Led by the charismatic Geronimo, they continually harassed federal troops and settlers moving into the area. Geronimo led his warriors south into Mexico to evade federal troops. However, when the Apache women were exiled to Florida, he was forced to surrender at Skeleton Canyon in 1886. However, the sword would not prove the ultimate death of the Indian. The railroad running through his land would expose him to the white man. The white man brought with him disease and liquor, and changed his way of life for forever. The railroad also brought with it hunters, which it employed so that it could feed its workers. Chief among these was William Cody, nicknamed Buffalo Bill. These hunters used telescopic sights which were advanced for the era. This allowed them to pick off the buffalo, which roamed across the plain. In 1885, fewer than 1,000 buffalo remained. By the 1800s, the national conscience had begun to stir. Ellen Hunt Jackson, a writer, published A Century of Dishonor and Romania, which spoke of the Indians' mistreatment. Debate still seesawed. Those who wanted to treat the Indians kindly still insisted on trying to get him to walk the white man's road. None of them really wanted the Indians to live alone and separate from the United States. Military men and religious leaders joined together to persuade the federal government to outlaw the sun dance. When the ghost dance cult later broke out, it is what caused the Battle of Wounded Knee. One attempt to reform the Indian policy was the Dawes Severalty Act of 1887, but it still reflected trying to get them to act like good white settlers. It forced Indian children to go to school where they were taught to disdain their national heritage. A policy favorable to the Indians would not come about until 1934. At this time, the Indian Reorganization Act attempted to mend some of the damage that the white man had done to the Indian way of life. But mostly this was too little too late, and Indian culture had been lost to the ages. However, since that time, the Indian population has risen. The census of 2000 counted more than 1.5 million Native Americans, urban and rural. With the conquest of the Indian, California was opened up to gold rushes. The original way to find this gold was to use a dishpan. Smaller lucky strikes occurred in Montana, Idaho, and other western states. These strikes were often the birthplaces of boom towns. However, once the gold dried up, the towns turned into ghosts. This is one of America's most storied periods. The Indians mostly conquered, but there were still small clashes. White men also fought white men. Robbers, thieves, battled with sheriffs and marshals. Saloons and brothels sprung up, looking to dig into the pockets of the miners. But money was not only to be made on the ground. With the railroad, ranchers could now ship their cattle up to be slaughtered in large industrial slaughterhouses. The term cowboy stemmed from this era. Cowboys were the people that looked after the cattle while they were moving them on the long drives. They became rapidly part of folklore, because often they were ambushed by people who wanted to steal the cattle and had to fight them off. These men lived on the open range with the cattle and were tough. While miners and cattlemen created the romantic legend of the West, it was a sober sod buster who wrote the final chapter. Once the myth of the great American desert was overcome, pioneer explorers discovered that the soil in the West was very fertile. The Homestead Act of 1862 allowed poor families to move out. This was done so that the backbone of the democracy could move forward and grow. This growth was rapid, and in 1890, an important date to remember, the superintendent of the census announced that for the first time America had no frontier line that was discernible. This astonishing growth rate showed America that its resources were not inexpendable. The first steps towards preserving America's natural resource was made when Yellowstone was created in 1872, shortly followed by Yosemite and Sequoia Park in 1890. The American farmer was a hardy man, made so by the fact that he continually had to face adversity. The prices of his crops would fluctuate. Parasites would wrap his farm in destruction. Droughts would destroy him. And banks would try and take his farm. Farmers were also exploited by corporations. Trusts raised prices on farmers' machinery and supplies until the levels were extremely high. Operators pushed storage rates to the ceiling at grain warehouses and elevators. The railroad often pushed freight rates so high that in one instance, farmers sometimes lost less if they burned their corn for fuel than if they shipped it. Although farmers made up 1/2 of the population in 1890, their rugged individualistic nature made it hard for them to organize. Manufacturers and railroad barons knew how to combine to promote their own interests, and increasingly so did industrial workers, but the farmers did not. They were unwilling to be consolidated or regimented. Farmers would never organize successfully until forced to do so by the federal government and Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal. When they did, this was a monumental political uprising. One man who did try and help farmers was Oliver H. Kelly, founder of the National Grange of the Patrons of Husbandry.